This was in 2019. Me and my buddy Jackson have a hobby for exploring abandoned places. I guess we were urban explorers, but we weren't really the type to do anything too illegal, or at least nothing too risky, which usually meant finding places further out from the city and in more remote areas. For this one, Jackson and I had found a small Reddit thread of a fire lookout tower posted in the community for abandoned places in our state. The OP didn't mention where it was, though, and seemed like he was trying to keep it from being too available to everyone online. I tried my luck at messaging him directly. And although he was hesitant, I eventually was able to get the coordinates from him, so long as I didn't pass it around to everyone else and ruin the spot. When we looked it up on maps, we could see there was a structure there, so it all looked legit. There weren't any other posts or anything on it, though, so it really seemed like the place was completely forgotten. We packed up and headed out there on a Monday morning. Getting there was a bit sketchy. No trails really and no clear sight lines of where we were headed. Just had to trust the GPS. The woods also had this really strange feeling. If Jackson wasn't there with me, I 100% would have booked it out of there and never looked back just from the feeling alone. Jackson also said he felt off, but we still continued walking. All the way up until just about a minute from the fire lookout, there were no signs whatsoever that we were even remotely in the right place or going in the right direction. No signs of trails, footpaths, or views of the structure. Nothing. It wasn't until we were literally 30 feet from it that we even saw it for the first time. We reached a clearing in the trees, and on the hill was, well, the lookout tower. It wasn't exactly the kind we were hoping for, but I was just happy it existed and the GPS got us there. This one wasn't sitting on tall stilts. It was basically just a cabin on top of the hill with a view over the forest. We circled the tower for a minute. The wood siding was gray and splintered, and the windows were either broken or covered in grime and fog so thick that it looked painted over. One side of the roof was even partially caved in, and the whole place sort of felt like it was leaning slightly, like the whole structure had shifted on its foundation. Jackson was noticeably more excited than I was. I think I still had that lingering uneasy feeling from the woods, but I didn't want to be a buzzkill after we'd come out all this way, so I didn't say anything. Jackson knocked on the door, then opened it. We stepped in. The inside was dark, even though windows surrounded pretty much all sides. The fog and grime that I mentioned earlier prevented pretty much any light from coming in. There was also a bunch of junk scattered on the floor. Some old tools, a broken lantern, and even some beer cans that looked decades old. But eerily, there was a piece of paper taped to the far wall. It was noticeably out of place, being clean and new from someone recently. On it were 3 words. "Hope you're happy." I showed it to Jackson and we both were pretty confused. I mean, clearly this had to be the stupid Redditor messing with us, leaving a cryptic note to scare us, knowing that we were going to show up. Still kind of weird, though. If it wasn't some joke, it seemed sort of passive-aggressive. Anyway, the sun was getting low, so I shut the door and we settled in for the night. I got out the camping stove and started boiling water to make ramen for dinner. Strangely, that whole night felt off. We didn't really talk for a while. I made the food. We ate and just sat there listening to the breeze make the cabin walls creak. Neither of us sparked up a conversation, which was really unusual. Just felt like there was almost this dreadful feeling. And I can't speak for Jackson, but I assume he felt it too since he didn't speak either. Eventually, when it got later, we both got in our sleeping bags and fell asleep. When I woke up, I remember opening my eyes to the pitch-black room and hearing just the slight creaks of the cabin, but something felt like it was missing. And that's when I rolled over and looked at Jackson's empty sleeping bag. I quickly sat up and looked around. Jackson. It was quiet. I froze up for a moment. Jackson. After I said his name again, there was a sudden thud against the wood. Then again, I tilted my head up and looked at the roof. Slow, quiet thuds moved across the ceiling. And then suddenly the door opened and Jackson stepped inside, nearly giving me a heart attack. He looked surprised to see me awake, but I told him to shush before he said anything. But whatever the hell I'd been hearing had stopped. Jackson said he just went out to take a leak. I asked if he saw anything on the roof, and he looked at me like I was crazy. I went out to see for myself and saw nothing. At that point, I thought maybe I was crazy. We got back in our sleeping bags and slept through the rest of the night. Next day, things still felt a little off there. I really didn't know what it was. Just everything felt too quiet and still. Me and Jackson spent most of the day exploring around the area, walking around and looking for anything else cool, but there really wasn't anything. The forest seemed to be the same half-dead trees for miles and miles and miles. Around sundown again, we got back to the lookout tower, ready to get back inside and settle for the night. But as Jackson went to close the door, he suddenly stopped. I looked back at him. He was frozen in place and his eyes were fixed on something. Then he said my name, telling me to come over there. I walked over and looked out the doorway. Standing maybe 40 feet from the cabin, right on the line between the clearing and the trees, there was a man. The man had shaggy, unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. He wore a gray flannel and had a rifle slung over his shoulder. Clearly, this guy was some sort of hunter. But what was really eerie was the look he had over his face. His eyes were dead and he had a dreadful empty look. "Hey, can we help you? Are you good?" I called out. The guy stared across the field at us for a few more seconds, then slowly turned and walked straight into the woods. I looked at Jackson and both of us were a little unsure about that guy. We made food and stayed in for a couple hours. We were a little more conversational, talking about our plan to leave tomorrow morning and definitely not recommend anyone to ever come here. And during that conversation, a faint shadow suddenly moved across Jackson's face. I quickly turned around and looked at the window behind me. Could barely see anything through it, but there was a shape, maybe a figure, moving along the outer wall. Jackson was quiet, so I knew he saw it, too. The figure moved all the way around to where the door was. My heart was racing. There was a long pause, then 3 soft knocks against the door. Jackson immediately got up and slammed the bolt lock down. There was another pause, then 3 loud, heavy hits shook the door. Neither of us moved. We were frozen, just completely horrified. But after those knocks, there wasn't anything else. No footsteps and no voices or shadows. I seriously have no clue how long we waited. Eventually, Jackson unlocked and opened the door, finding no one and nothing out there. We stayed up through the entire night, both paranoid and feeling really uneasy. We tried to figure out who we thought it was, if it was the hunter from earlier. He did look creepy as hell, but this didn't feel like it was him. It felt like something else. I know that sounds crazy, but I don't know what else to think. When the sun came up, we booked it out of the cabin. The whole way back through the woods was just unsettling and eerie, like we were being watched. When we made it out, the first thing I did was check on Reddit with the OP who gave us the coordinates to ask if he had any weird encounters at the lookout tower, but the post was removed and the account was deleted. Honestly, I think the guy had similar encounters and experiences, and likely that's why he left the ominous note of, "Hope you're happy." Jackson and I are still great friends and still actually explore abandoned places. We've had other encounters, but none like this one. Both of us are still genuinely freaked out about what happened during the 2 nights we visited that lookout tower and have no idea what it was that we experienced there. I'm keeping my name anonymous for privacy reasons, but this happened just 5 years ago. At the time, I was traveling around with my dog, Rocky. I know, not the most unique name, but I named him after the mountain range. I found him stray in 3 years prior. He was a medium-sized Australian Shepherd mix and the vet said he was between 6 to 7 years old when I found him. There was no information on him whatsoever. And after weeks of being unsuccessful in finding his owners, I made the decision to adopt him. He became sort of my adventure buddy, going on hikes and backpacking trips year-round, and we both loved it. The trip this happened on was honestly nothing crazy. It was just supposed to be a one-day in one-day out backpack along a firebreak trail to a retired lookout tower. I really couldn't find too much info on the place. At least not up-to-date info. Best I could find were some really old rules about it being a non-renewable first-come first-served public rest shelter with a 3-night limit. But like I said, that info was super outdated. I didn't care too much to do any more research than that because I wasn't even planning to stay the night in the tower. The idea was to reach the ridge, take a look around, and hike another few miles down to a creek with a small tent campsite. However, this whole idea fell through as when me and Rocky were about 30 minutes out from the tower, dark, heavy clouds started rolling overhead. We rushed to the tower and with a view of the valley from the ledge, I could see a really bad rain and thunderstorm hitting the mountain directly across from us. It looked like it was headed our way. I didn't mind so much camping in my tent during a storm. But the problem was that I didn't know if we could make it to the campsite and set up before the storm hits. After a couple minutes of thinking, the decision was made for me by the sudden onset of rain downpouring on the lookout tower. So, I decided to hunker down inside the tower with Rocky, at least to let the storm pass. It was then that I got a really good look at the place. It was mostly what I expected. White paint thinning on the walls, a rusted stove built into the corner, and aside from that, completely empty. Not even a trashy old mattress that most public forest shelters usually have. Within minutes, the storm hit twice as hard. Rain was coming down so heavy I couldn't even see the forest past the windows, and I could feel the wind cutting inside between the gaps in the wood. The tower had a bit of give to it as well, swaying a bit every time a gust of wind would hit it, and it didn't look like it was slowing down anytime soon. I laid out my sleeping bag to make a more comfortable rest area, then took out my dinner stuff and made a little freeze-dried meal. Rocky was pretty shaken by the storm, though. He wouldn't settle, pacing near the door with his tail tucked and quietly whining. He never liked storms, but this one definitely made him feel worse than usual. Thought it was probably the movement of the tower, or maybe even the heights. I called him over and had him sit next to me so I could pet him to quiet him down and get him to relax a little. But when it was just the sound of the rain drumming on the roof, I heard something else. It was a faint hollow thunk sound like something metal shifting beneath the floor. It was subtle enough to blend in with the rain and only noticeable during short periods where the rain would slow down a bit. After a minute or two, though, I couldn't hear it anymore. Or maybe my mind drowned it out. I'm not really sure. Eventually, I laid down and Rocky burrowed in the sleeping bag with me. The rain and thunder started to feel comforting, I guess, and I fell asleep. Next thing I knew, I woke up and checked my watch, seeing it was just past 2 a.m. And right away, something was missing. The noise of rain and everything. It was just silent. I sat up, realizing Rocky wasn't in my sleeping bag anymore. He was over by the door, giving me that look like he needed to go out and quietly whining again. I took a moment, then got up and put my shoes on and grabbed the flashlight. I opened the door and stepped outside with him, walking down the creaky steps and letting him roam the field between the tower and the forest. After the hours of heavy rain, the dead silence of the forest now was kind of unsettling. I stayed near the tower, just keeping my flashlight on Rocky as he did his business. But then I heard the slightest sound behind me, a thin metal squeak from a small wind gust. I turned around and pointed my flashlight under the lookout tower, immediately spotting what looked like a metal cellar door, like one of those underground ones that old houses sometimes have. I figured this one must have been for storage back when the tower was in use, maybe for keeping dry firewood and tools or something. But then I remembered the sounds I heard overnight. The metal thump sounds. And honestly, something in my gut knew the moment I saw those cellar doors that those sounds had to be from the cellar doors opening and closing, or maybe even something moving around inside the cellar. I kept the flashlight on it and approached it, then slowly lifted one of the doors and peeked inside. There were maybe 5 or 6 steps. It didn't go down very far. And on the stairs, there were fresh wet spots of mud going up every step. But after looking at it for just a moment, Rocky suddenly barked. It was just one sharp, terrified bark. I dropped the door closed and spun around just quick enough to see something shift in the tree lean just past Rocky. I immediately called him back, then ran up the stairs and inside the tower. Thankfully, I'd only unpacked my sleeping bag, so I quickly rolled it up and clicked it to my backpack. Someone was out there watching us, and I was not staying to find out why. I made Rocky stay close, and we quickly exited the tower and got back down to the base. I instinctively turned around and shined the flashlight back under the tower at the cellar. The doors were open. Then I looked down at Rocky. His eyes stared at the cellar intensely, clearly scared of whatever was in there. We hurried away, getting right back onto the fire break trail. We pretty much ran for a whole mile before the rain started pouring down again. So, we took it easy and eventually made it back. I called the Forest Service that morning and it only made me more terrified of what could have happened. The ranger said that the lookout tower I mentioned was not in service and off-limits to the public. I couldn't get him to spill any specifics, but from the little hints I felt like I got, it sounded like some things had been happening in that area that caused them to just stop allowing people to use the tower. That's why I couldn't find any information on it. I think there's a lot of possible explanations for what happened out there, but none of them make me feel any better. The most harmless explanation is someone was living in the cellar of the retired tower for who knows how long. But even then, why did they leave in the middle of the night? And why were they watching us from the trees? It's been a while, so I've mostly come to terms with not having any answers. But I think the chances are slim that if I hadn't have left, nothing else would have happened. This happened 3 decades ago. Obviously, I'm an older guy now, but when I was in my 20s, I used to do summer work with the Forest Ranger Service as a fire lookout. I did it for almost 9 summers in a row. It was paid work, so while I was in college and off for summer breaks, I loved it. Might have even done it for free. The job was simple and straightforward. Essentially marking down a few data points once an hour like temperature, wind, and humidity, and of course scouting for fires. Aside from that, I was alone up there and could do really whatever I felt like. Often I would walk the trails around the lookout station and just enjoy the scenery. Over the years, I became very capable in the woods. And aside from this one night, I never really had anything unsettling happen. The days would just go by sort of the same and were always peaceful and relaxing. I don't remember most of the start of this day because it was a very repetitive normal day at the lookout station. Even a few hours past sunset, nothing really happened. I recorded my last data points for the night and radioed into the ranger station that I was done with my shift and clocking out for the day. The overnight ranger that was basically there every night was another young man, Brady. I'd only met him in person a handful of times, but I talked to him almost every night as there wasn't all that much else to do. And whenever there were important things to radio in, he was the guy to receive my calls. After making some food and resting on the bed for a bit, I decided to get some air and head onto the balcony to look at the clear night sky. Took all but half a second to notice a bright flickering light below the tower. It was just in the trees, not more than a quarter mile from me. There were way too many trees in the way to get a perfect view, but I knew it was a campfire of some sorts by the color and the way it was flickering. Now, at the time, there was a campfire ban due to dry weather. So, this was actually a pretty big deal that needed to be sorted immediately. I radioed into Brady asking about permits and if he knew who could have been out there, but he said he had no clue and that no permits were handed out to be camping there that night. I told him exactly where it was and that it was strangely close to my lookout station. Brady told me since it was so close to just go let the campers know to put it out and to not even worry about making them leave or anything even though they didn't have a permit to be in the area. So, I took my radio and my flashlight and headed down the stairs, then began walking toward the campfire. Really, I never felt too worried heading out there. The walk was like 5 minutes and I figured it would all go over easy. Again, I wasn't forcing them to leave. I was just there to tell them to put out the fire. After a short walk, I got to the campsite, but it really wasn't a campsite at all. It was just a fire with no one around it. Worse yet, it was more of a bonfire. Pretty much just some logs stacked up on the ground and lit on fire. Almost like whoever it was using it to get my attention. I called out a few times but got no responses. I remember starting to get creeped out, shining my flashlight around for a few minutes. The whole forest was quiet, though, and it didn't seem like anyone was around. I radioed into Brady, telling him that nobody was around here and that I thought it might have been some sort of prank to kind of lead me into the woods for no reason. But Brady didn't respond. I radioed again, but it was just static, which in my 9 years of doing this, I'd never not gotten a response. I knew this was not normal. A chill hit my body and I kicked over the logs and buried the fire, then hurried back through the woods to the lookout station. I was shining the light around frantically, questioning why I even listened to him, and went out there. When I made it back, I ran up the stairs, and right when I got to the top, my stomach tightened and my heart started racing. The whole place was ransacked. I had never felt so terrified and fearful in my entire life. I quickly used the main station radio to try contacting Brady again, but with no luck. I then radioed into authorities that something really weird was going on. I didn't know what to say, but that someone was trespassing and messing with our stuff. I had to make the decision to either stay at the lookout or hike out of there. And even though it was dark, I chose to hike out. I felt like staying knowing there was no way out if whoever was out there came back was the more risky option. The hike was a well-defined trail 3 miles down to the ranger station where Brady was stationed at and then another mile to the road. I barely packed anything and quickly left. The whole hour of hurrying through the woods was awful. It was so quiet that every step I made felt like it was giving me away. But I felt relief when I saw the dim lights outside of the ranger station. I called out Brady's name as I approached it until I noticed the door was wide open. I walked inside and Brady wasn't there. From the looks of it, he had walked outside for some reason, maybe to check on something he heard, then just vanished. I was out of there within seconds, running to the road and eventually meeting the cops there a few minutes later. They searched a huge perimeter over the next few days. Brady was never found. The whole fire thing was some sort of planned distraction, and I'm assuming they did something near Brady as well to get his attention and get him out of the cabin. Then again, I'm not sure. To be fully transparent, the state kept everything tightly under wraps because this happened in a fairly big touristy park in the state. Back then, I guess it was way easier to keep it all hush. You'd be surprised how often things would just go unheard, let alone when the state didn't want it to be known. That was the year I stopped going there during the summers. And as far as I know, nobody else ever worked at that tower after me. The listing didn't show up any years afterward. Even all these years later though, I still constantly wonder what really happened that night and how close I was to going missing just like Brady did.